Let's do it. All right. Well, Tom, I was thinking about what you said on Wednesday about you like podcasts where you just like get in with the hard question.
Straight in,
And
head
so
first.
you started this advanced movement therapy certification,
Yep.
and you do a lot of the movement assessment or teach people how to do self-assessment. And so I have a question. So for the person who has been, let's say, athletic, maybe even for the person who's just starting out, um, there's a lot of advice out there, or maybe opinions that would be to the contrary of your thoughts on this stuff. So the question would be like, I started lifting, I don't know, over a decade ago, whatever, and I've gotten to, over 500 pound deadlift, over 400 pound squat. And I never did any of these self-assessments or anything that I've seen on your Instagram page and your other social media. So why should someone like me care about these movement assessments? What do you think?
Well, we can always look at what you don't measure, you can't manage, and what you don't manage, you can't improve upon. So starting somewhere for anything is good, right? I mean, the worst thing we can do is get so confused and everyone's just like, I don't know where to start. I'm like, start with push-ups, start with body weight squats. How much time can you allot? What are your goals? What's the reason that you desired to lift 500 pounds, right? Is it just this physical goal, mental goal that you wanted to achieve? Because if we don't have that endpoint, that thing to strive for, it's easy to lose our way. So if we start with a form of assessment, even something as simple as, with a self-awareness movement scan, can you get your chin to your chest? Do you have any neck pain? Yes or no? Can you touch your toes? Can you back bend? Can you rotate? Can you side bend? Can you single leg balance? Can you squat? Now, if you can't do some of those things, or some of those feel a little different one side or the other, then you can start thinking, I'm like, okay, well, I can't really rotate to the right. Why is that? Oh, my hips don't open. Okay, well, maybe we go down to the ground and start doing hip openers. Maybe we start doing ground mobility work to create a little bit more balance. Because if I'm deadlifting, if I can't hinge into one hip, I've got tension on one side of the body. If I'm kettlebell swinging and I can't extend one hip to lock out, that's going to create rotations. So now it's going to cause pain and overuse. But if I have some way of screening myself to say, hey, I have these fundamental baselines of movement proficiency, now it's safe to load it. But what a lot of people don't realize is when we have that asymmetry, say you have neural tension or hamstring tightness on one side of the body and you're doing a deadlift, well, when you go down to engage with the weight, you've already pre-tensioned that one side of your body. Well, that's going to create a torque in your pelvis. And when you go to lift that, now you're creating a torque and compression through your spine. Now, all of a sudden, someone says, well, I did deadlifts and it hurt my back. I'm like, no, it's so your body wasn't symmetrical enough to do deadlifts, or you didn't earn the right to deadlift that weight from that position. So maybe we need to bring it up until we correct the issue. To make a long story shorter or longer, we don't want people to get discouraged from training and moving. And oftentimes when they hurt themselves doing something like, oh, that hurt myself, and then it creates fear. Then it creates avoidance. Then it creates more deconditioning. They lose motivation. They lose discipline. And now it just becomes this massive cascade of deadlifts hurt my back. I'm never touching those again. I don't know how many athletes, former athletes and clients, they're like, yeah, deadlifts hurt my back. I'm like, if you did it right, they should actually make you stronger and not hurt your back, should actually get rid of a lot of your back pain. But because they already have that belief system in place that one particular movement hurt them, it's really hard to break that out. But if we can instill confidence in people's ability just to move their own body against gravity and without pain, okay, great. The nervous system's saying, this is safe. Let's load this up. But if they struggle bending forward to pick up their shoe, should we give them a weight at that point? Probably not. We should find out what's causing that tightness or that discomfort before we start adding resistance and conditioning on top of that. So trying to create a little bit better self-awareness with just the general population or even my athletes, I teach them how to scan themselves from a top-down, center-out perspective, correct imbalances before they become an issue so that they don't create an injury in their body just from a simple imbalance that can just generally occur either from everyday activities or just their sport.
I can't tell you how many people that I've known that, especially when when I started deadlifting, and I was really excited because I was seeing gains and I was really having a great
Yeah.
time. And I'd tell my buddies about it. Oh no, man, I hurt my back deadlifting. I don't deadlift anymore. I said, really? Well, what do you do? Well, I do squats and I do, bench press. And
Right.
they start telling me all these things. I'm like, okay, you didn't hurt your back doing deadlifts.
No.
There's something else there,
Yeah.
but I would have no idea what it
No.
was. I mean, so
Right.
I heard
Unless
that
you
so much.
unless you go get a full orthopedic assessment to see,
Yep.
okay, well, here's the parts that aren't moving. Here's the muscles that are disengaged. Here's the ones that are being overused. You've got neural tension here that's causing tightness in these muscles. You don't know, but we can simplify it. A lot of the rehab stuff, performance stuff, it's an 80-20 principle. When we take a perspective of, okay, how did we develop as human beings? Well, we developed in the embryo from the center out. And now we control the body and movement from the top down. Okay, cool. If our visual system, inner ears, brain is working, communicating with the body, great. We have some form of communication that can interpret information, create motor systems, motor patterns, and then initiate them. But where a lot of us, I mean, if you guys have kids and you watch your kids develop, where do they start? It's from the ground. Well, we can restore a lot of what was lost just by going back on the ground, sitting, transitioning, rocking, rolling, like just getting up from the ground, practicing those patterns right and left can help restore a lot what was lost. But it can also expose some of the restrictions that we have created in our bodies because we're so good at being in the upright position and we don't move enough through all the planes that we can hide stuff. It's a survival mechanism, right? Like we adapt, we compensate so that we can run away from the tiger. But if those compensations are left in place for too long and not checked on, well, now we create overuse problems. And it's simply because you're just moving the body in an asymmetrical way repetitively, maybe in a low load over time, or that one time you pick up the heavy thing, system fails, right? And it wasn't that one thing that caused the problem. It was the years of neglect of those parts that are not contributing to the system that caused you to shift forces into that part that now got overused and now disrupted. So when we can create a little bit of better self-awareness in people, we can probably prevent a lot of those little aches, strains, and, disincentivization of wanting to lift weights, wanting to move fast, because if we don't do that, we just decline.
Man, so many topics here. I want to come back to like the preconceived beliefs that people may have going into exercising or starting a athletic endeavor.
Yep.
So, gosh, I don't know how to phrase this. So I've noticed kind of both ways. So you mentioned like people might have this preconceived notion, well, if I do deadlifts, like
Yep.
that's going to cause my back to hurt, whatever. But I've taught I've done a deadlift seminar every Easter for like, I don't know, the last 5 or 6 years. And I always get somebody comes in who has been through some of these movement assessment courses, and
Sure.
they haven't deadlifted before because they've always been told, well, you can't start deadlifting until X, Y, and Z happens. And then they come into my deadlift seminar and they say, well, I have tight hip flexors or whatever the
Sure.
case may be. And I always tell them, like, well, let's just give this a try, right?
Sure.
And then lo and behold, they can go ahead and do it. Have you noticed any, let's say, nocebo happening that maybe somebody, and it certainly can't happen to everybody, but there are
No.
people who will go through some of these assessments
Yep.
and then nocebo themselves into
Yep.
thinking,
Oh,
well, I can't do this until I meet these benchmarks.
yeah. So the information that they're getting from those experts, it's because those experts don't understand enough that the deadlift is a rehabilitation exercise, not just a performance exercise. It is biologically intuitive. We do that. It's the first lift we do. When you watch, I was watching my kids grow up, obviously, and they would squat. The squat's like that first pattern so that they can lower themselves to the ground. The squat is the thing that they lose their balance. They drop their center of gravity to catch their balance. So the squat is the first pattern, but the first lift is actually the deadlift, because they'll squat. I watched my son squat down to pick up a little dumbbell when he was like 2 or a year and a half, and he couldn't lift it. So what did he do? He lifted his hips, elevated his center of gravity, and he hinged because he gave himself a biological mechanical advantage. So he deadlifted the weight up to bring it up into his chest to carry it and throw the weight into a garbage can, because that's what he was doing. So it's not that people look at the deadlift or squat or some of these high performance exercises as just, well, these are just performance. I'm like, no, we do these as human beings. If you bend over to pick up a shoe, if you bend over to pick up anything off the ground, it's a deadlift. So you can do it, we should do it, but then sometimes, again, if someone's got some symmetry to them, and say they can only get their hands past their knees, great, pull the weight up towards them. They can still pattern that out. You can still coach them with a nice neutral spine, bracing the core, gripping the ground with the feet, lock those shoulders into place. You can teach them all the mechanics. And as they get more proficient with that pattern, you just lower the weight down, because the strength in that range of motion might be the problem. They just might not be strong there. Now, all of a sudden you add strength into that range. The nervous system says, oh, this is safe. I'm going to give you more range of motion, because the nervous system's a brake system. The nervous system is designed to protect us from harm. And anytime it detects threat, it will either create tightness, guarding, create compensations, or overstabilize the area, right? But once you understand that the pattern can actually fix the problem, you just need to maybe gauge it as to how far do they deadlift, how far do they go. Well, now it's restorative. And for as long as I've been doing this from a rehab and performance perspective, when I look at my top level athletes, I look at them through, because they're already massive engines. They are already working at the peak that they can work at. Now I look at them through a rehab lens. I'm like, how can I fine tune this machine? And oftentimes you'll find these little asymmetries and imbalances that they're hiding. Maybe they had an old concussion and they can't hold gaze stabilization to the left. So now they're a little inhibited on this left side. And we get them doing rolling patterns, and we get them doing eye exercises and all that stuff, right? Typical concussion stuff. And all of a sudden their performance goes up. All of a sudden they can put more weight on the bar, simply because we corrected some control issues that they were hiding for the years, and the nervous system was dampening them. And then you go on the other end of the spectrum, you have an 85-year-old lady who's got balance issues. And I'm like, I'm going to teach you a deadlift, because that's going to help with balance and all the posture problems that you've created over the years from slouching. So once you start looking at both ends of the spectrum of rehab and performance, it's the same spectrum. They're just on different ends. And when we can take tools from one end, we can apply for high performance. And when we take the high performance tools on the other end, we can apply it to better rehabilitation. So it's understanding kind of, yes, this is a strength exercise, but it can be very restorative. It actually used to be called the health lift until the powerlifting community took it over. And then they call it a deadlift, because you're lifting a dead weight off the ground.
All right. So let me see if I can maybe rephrase that. So for those people who are possibly noceboing themselves into thinking, so I go to a physio or one of these movement specialists, and, we go through these assessments, and they're like, well, I don't think you should be deadlifting until we meet these bars. And so they walk away from that thinking, well, I can't deadlift. So it may just be miscommunication from the coach's part to the lifters, not so much that, hey, these are hard and fast rules that we need to live by, or these are benchmarks that you have to meet before you can do said thing. Am I summing that up a little bit?
Yeah, it could be just a communication issue where the patient hears, or the client hears, I cannot deadlift until I meet these benchmarks. And maybe the practitioner is saying, hey, we should probably clean these things up so you can deadlift more effectively or more safely. Not to say that you can't do it. It's just we've got some imbalances to correct so that it makes it better over here. But again, this is where communication expectation needs to be laid out so specifically with people, because people hear kind of what they want to hear, or they just hear something completely different. And I don't know how many times I would talk to a patient. I'm like, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. They go to their surgeon and they say, oh, my physio said I can do this. And all of a sudden we get a call. Why the hell are you getting your patient to do this? I'm like, I did not say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is not what I said at all. And then they're like, oh, I'm like, okay, well, I'm glad we had this talk. So now we're all on the same page. But that telephone line, the amount of information that they heard and put forward to the other professional was not what I said at all.
Yeah.
Right?
It's something like what I said, but that's not what I said.
Something like what I said. And I'm like, no, we're not doing that yet. The goal is to get there, but here's the steps what we need to take to do that. And this is where it's helpful to build that communication relationship with other professionals. Be like, hey, I've got this client, we're this mutual client. They said it's okay that we can communicate. They came in and said that they can't deadlift. Can I get a better understanding why? And oftentimes they'll be like, no, I never said that they couldn't deadlift. I just said that we need to clean up these imbalances so that they can deadlift better. Right. So building those relationships as well, not just a communication from the client, but to other professionals is helpful. But, everyone speaking the same language and understanding the same principles is also helpful, which is, again, one of the things why I created the AMT, because it works across clinicians, coaches, personal trainers, chiros, physios, everybody, right? So it's like building this framework that everyone can kind of speak the same language and help build build their knowledge upon.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
I want to ask something in relationship to what you've talked about, and I know that Coach, you've handled this a lot, and I'm just coming at this from a standpoint of people who have a problem or that they've had something that they're compensating for.
Yep.
Because you remember you talked about that, and then also I know that just from my knowledge, my personal experience with Coach, that he's had numerous clients that were aged, older than me.
Sure.
And everybody has some kind of little thing that they compensate for. So this isn't my main part of my question, but first of all, when you're talking about communication, getting those people to, I don't know, is the word admit that they have something that they're compensating for, or if you just, or in your conversation with them, you say, well, I believe you're compensating for this, or how what you go into that analysis or that conversation with them. Do you find it's hard for people to admit that, I favor this side, or do you find it's hard for them to admit that or to come forth with that?
It's not that.
And hold on to that. So just, let me say this also.
Sure.
And so whatever they're compensating, if they've compensated for it for so long and it becomes part of their regular walk, and they don't realize they're compensating for it, how long and how difficult is it to get somebody retrained or to discover that area and to work through that so that you can normalize their gait, normalize their ability to lift, to exercise at all? Does that make sense?
Yes. So let's break that up a bit. So to answer the second question, or let's answer the first question.
Okay.
We don't need to get people to admit. We just need to get them to realize and be aware of it.
Okay.
And to do that, every client that comes into our facility, we treat them like students. We tell them exactly, okay, so we should be able to get our chin to our chest. We should have that 80-degree straight leg raise.
Right.
Here's the range of motion. Here's your optimal range of motion for your hips. Should be 30 to 40 this way, 40 to 50 this way. And you're kind of halfway. You're like, okay, well, the hips needs to rotate. If the hips don't rotate, we might be going into our back. Okay. Once we start educating the clients about their bodies and showing them the parts that aren't moving, maybe the parts that are a little bit weaker, some of the hypotheses that we're coming up with, this might be why you're walking this way, because your single leg balance, you don't have these deep hip rotators, your foot's is shut off. We've got this cross cord reflex that's not working, whatever. Once they start understanding the connection and the relationship of the body and some of these other parts that don't seem like they might be related to the back pain, such as a foot, but once you start showing them the connection and how the foot highly affects the hip and the hip affects the low back, then the light switch comes on. You're like, oh, I didn't realize
realization.
that.
Admit was the wrong word, but realization.
So they just need to be aware of it. And they're like, I didn't know that, but now they know. Okay. And then you provide them the solutions. So this is what's neat about the nervous system is when we apply the right inputs, when we treat the right part of the body, and oftentimes it's not the painful area, because the painful area is a symptom area. The problems are usually other places. All of a sudden we go back, all of a sudden they can touch their toes. Their single leg balance is better. That muscle that was turned off now switches on. So it wasn't a weakness issue. It was an inhibition. So once you start to show them what their body's doing or not doing, apply some kind of input change, apply some different body awareness, give them a different pattern or a posture, and then you recheck the things that weren't working, and all of a sudden they start working better. Now we've got buy-in. Now we have belief. Oh, I see that, because
Confidence.
they can feel it. It's not that they need to see it; they need to feel the change, and it needs to be meaningful change, right? If all of a sudden they couldn't touch their toes for 10 years, and all of a sudden we get them to touch their toes in 60 seconds, that's magic. But I'm like, not really. It's just, applying certain inputs to the body and allowing the body to move into that range it hasn't felt for a long time. Okay. And then coming back to the second part of your question, which I've now forgotten.
How long or how difficult is it to restore normal function?
So it depends on how long they've been doing it for, because the brain is a very efficient machine. Once it learns a pattern, which is why it's easier to train good habits rather than overwrite bad habits, because those neural pathways, as long as they've been there, think of them like they've been laid down. That myelin, those neural connections, those tracks are laid, right? And the body will always look for the most efficient path possible, because that's energy conservation, which is part of survival. So we always default to what's easy and what's the most energy efficient. If we have very solid habits or movement patterns, we can't erase them. They're there forever. This is what the research shows us. However, we need to write new patterns. So we need to get them to consciously do something different until it becomes unconscious, which can take a while. But this is also why it's so important that, when we're assessing, we have a shoulder that doesn't lift, we do some manual therapy. Oh, it feels better. Great. Okay. We altered the inputs. We integrated some new movement patterns and postures and position, and then we give them load. Because when we add load to a pattern, we're telling the nervous system, hey, we're happy with this. Let's hit the save button on it. It's reinforcing that new pattern. But if we do the manual therapy or the lacrosse ball or whatever it is, and we just do some movement, it doesn't hold permanently. We created temporary change that feels good, but the body will revert back to what it knows, which is typically the old patterns. So to answer your question, it really depends on how long they've been doing it. And also, did those patterns create some structural changes that are a little bit more permanent as well? Because if you've got somebody who's walking with this little wobble gait and this hip is kicking out, but over the course of 10 years, they've worn down that hip joint and it's now super arthritic. We can make some changes. We can probably get them out of pain. Right. Are we going to completely shift that? Probably not, because we're kind of on the path already to a hip replacement at that point. So when the physical structures already created these permanent changes, you see those very kyphotic, very rounded spines, and they're like cement. That's because the vertebrae wedged themselves. They're not flat anymore. So there's literally no opportunity to get them upright. It's just, can we prevent that wedge from getting more compressed and getting more kyphotic? Right? So when somebody comes in and they're like, I got all this pain and I can't move, and I look at their passive range of motion, I'm like, this is awesome. I'm like, you've got range of motion. We have the range to play with. We just have to get you strong in it. Or I'm like, oh, this is a capsular restriction, but we can change this, right? So as long as we know what anatomy we're playing with, and then how to foster in new movement patterns from the ground up or what have you, it can dictate how quickly we can make a change. So if it's a motor control issue, it happens pretty quickly. If it's a structural issue, it's going to take a little bit more time, because connective tissue adapts at a much slower rate than muscles, right? Muscles 6 to 8 weeks, connective tissue 6 to 9 months. And this is where, we can get into why plateaus happen, because there's either a safety issue. If the structure is not keeping up to the neuromuscular demand, the nervous system will start to downregulate or keep you plateaued until the connective tissue and joints have caught up.
Well, Tom, you mentioned creating the AMT. So we're a little bit into this thing now, but, would you mind telling everybody, who the heck are you? What is AMT? Where are you located? All that stuff.
Yeah. So, for those of you, you can, sorry, I'm going to back that up. My name is Tom Swales. I'm a physiotherapist. I'm a strength coach. I'm an athletic trainer trained in the US. I do acupuncture. I do manipulation. I have Russian kettlebell certification. So I have lots of manual rehabilitation, sports performance certifications. And over the course of 2 decades that I've been doing this now, I've created a lot of confusion in my own practice. And to eliminate a lot of the confusion and know which tools to use on the right person at the right time for the right thing, I, what I feel, I found kind of the common principles or commonalities across rehabilitation, sports performance, and distilled it down into what I call the advanced movement therapist certification. And basically it's a blueprint and a map on how to assess thoroughly, staying consistent on the front end so we don't miss important information, how the body prioritizes certain structures over the others, how to rebuild movement from the ground up, how to integrate the neurological system if there's some top-down control problems, and then how to prioritize what you need to treat in the specific order based on the developmental model and based on priority of survival and structure orientation. So it literally takes everything that I've learned over the last 20 years and distills it down into a framework that people can quickly apply to their practices, but they can also build new information upon. So it's more of a framework to organize what you know, but it allows you to build new information into. And the problem that I was trying to solve was one for myself as a new clinician coming out of school. I was very disorganized. You take all these courses, you're like, okay, flavor of the month, everybody gets this now. But then it works for some people, it doesn't work for others. You're like, okay, time to take another course, right? This solves this solves specific problems for a specific population, but not for everybody. So then you start getting confused, you're getting frustrated. You're like, I have all this knowledge, but I don't know how to apply it effectively. And then once I started taking a step back and like, what are the common principles that we use as practitioners, coaches, clinicians? And it's essentially psychology, neurology, biology, chemistry, and physics. And once I started understanding those 5 principles, then I can explain what we do, why we do it, and how we do it better. Because any new information, I'm like, can I bounce it off these principles? Because these principles don't change. These principles are, they don't change over time. They don't change based on other people's opinions. It's like, these are universal laws. And if you have these universal laws that are unchangeable, well, then it's very easy to bounce off of what you learn new. Does this hold true to these principles? If it doesn't, well, then maybe we don't use it, right? It might be effective, but it's not something that we're going to use a majority of the time. And then looking at the actual process of, okay, well, what is the actual process of an assessment? Okay, great. I go collect the client. I take a history, find out who they are, where they've been, their past injuries. Cool. I'm building a picture. I'm building rapport. I'm building safety. I'm building trust, which is psychology, right? I have to be able to communicate effectively so that they feel safe, so that their nervous system starts to calm down. And then anything I do physically, it creates change in their system. But if I don't get past that first pillar of creating trust and safety, their body and their nervous system will never let me in, right? Because they're like, I don't trust this person. And then you look at the nervous system through movement. Movement is our feedback loop to know if we're effective. Okay, great. You can touch your toes. You can single leg balance. Can't do that. Go do some manual stuff. All of a sudden something's changed. Cool. What happened there? And then you look at biology and chemistry, how the cells are adapting, how the tissues are adapting. What is nutrition, right? Bodies are breaking that down into its constituents for molecules to build the tissues. And then you look at physics, which is, Newtonian physics, which is in the 3-dimensional world, matter. And then you look at quantum, which is energy. Everything in the universe is vibration, frequency, and energy. But a thought will create a chemical reaction in our body, which affects the biology. But that comes back to someone's beliefs. Which is why placebos work, right? So that is in a nutshell kind of the principles, but then there's an algorithm behind it, of subjective history. Look at their movement, look at their posture, global movement scan, neurological scan. So I laid out an entire blueprint or algorithm in which to move through the body quickly and effectively so that we don't miss information, and we don't assume that something's not relevant until it's cleared out. Because in our training, we're not taught how to be really consistent with our assessment. and we're allowed creativity, but then things are missed. And then what ends up happening is on the back end, everybody gets protocols. I'm like, well, that's cookie cutter. But if you're consistent on the front end with your assessment, well, that allows creativity on the back end with your treatment, because you're finding all the pieces that are wrong, and you can get creative with your treatment on the back end to solve whatever the pain or injury that they're happening. So in my own practice growing up, it created organization and confidence. In our clinic, it created consistency across clinicians and coaches, because everyone goes through the system. Everyone can now communicate the same way. Everyone has a framework, and we've literally systematized and operationalized results, because when everybody takes this approach, people get better pretty damn quick, and it's cool to see. And everyone, I'm not creating robots. I want people to do different courses, but they can build that information in. And then to level up, again, we would see clients, they'd come to our facility and they'd say, well, I was everywhere else in town and you're my last hope. And it's disheartening, because they would waste so much time, money, and energy at these other places. And I'm like, why didn't they look at this? Like, for us, it's common sense, but I'm like, we can do better as a profession. We can do better as coaches to just set a higher bar, like a higher standard bar for everybody to come into. So at least everyone's kind of on the same level for effectiveness to help more people. So from a kind of micro, my own problem, to more of a macro, global, I guess, systemic problem in kind of healthcare and the performance side of things, that's essentially why I created the AMT.
Man,
Awesome.
I gotta say something about that too. Is that I know so many people that have gone to this place or this
Yep.
gym or that gym, or I got this coach for a while, or I got that the coach for a while, or I tried that program who shall not be named,
Yep.
that just has lots of crazy people in it, and injuries as well. As that trust thing that you're talking about, is that I know I've had conversations with people that just, well, I'm doing this and he's having me do this, but I think it's going to hurt me. I don't really, I'm gonna find somebody else because there's not that. Bottom line is there's not that trust there.
Yeah.
And
that's
so when I began training with with Dustin, is that I already trusted him, but I still had apprehension. The first time I put a heavy load on the bar, uh, but I trusted him, and that made all the difference in the world.
yeah.
So if you don't trust the people that, like you're just talking about, building trust with your patient,
Yeah.
if you don't have that trust there is apprehension,
Yeah.
and you do tense up. Even like, even if you're just trying for a PR, there's a little bit of tension there already in your body. But
Oh,
it's
for
a
sure.
matter of, do I trust my coach?
Yep.
Because he wouldn't let this happen
Yep.
if he didn't have confidence in me.
Yep. And what created the trust for you? I mean, it wasn't like the straight PR,
No,
under the bar.
you know what? Personal relationship.
Right.
Having a long conversation, understanding what he's about, and honestly, we did a thing like he would do this deadlift thing, at his gym, and I remember going the first time we did this thing, and so I went in there, and we're all in there, and he's showing us all how to deadlift, and there's a guy, man, he had years on me, and he lifted way more weight than I did, and I'm like, well, I can do that, but I got in there and I lifted, this real minor amount of weight, and I did kind of thought I did what he told me to, and he goes, okay, you're done. Kind of hurt my feelings. I'm like, well, and then when I went and talked to him, he said, because you're not listening. You were doing this, you were doing this, you were doing this, and I'm not gonna let you hurt yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do this.
Yeah.
I was all in.
Right.
I mean, of course, he's a friend, but it was like at that point as a coach,
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm all in. But if
Yeah.
you don't have that trust,
Yeah.
you're not going to go into a place and come back to it if you don't have trust, if you don't believe in
Yeah.
what he knows or what
Yeah.
you know or what any coach knows for that matter.
Well, it's building that relationship, that connection as well with the individual. And, obviously you like them enough that you want to spend time with them too. But, it's a whole package thing, because
Yeah.
you can be the most technically sound coach, clinician, whatever. But if you're not likable, if you don't have that empathy, if you don't have that rapport building, that body language that people just want to be in your presence, they won't come back.
Yeah.
Like, that comes back to the psychology, and the subconscious mind is constantly scanning the environment. And for somebody who's not likable, that comes back to a subconscious desire for survival. I'm like, I hear what you're saying. It sounds good, but I'm feeling something different. And human beings don't make decisions logically. It is
Hmm.
always feeling based every single time. It doesn't matter, because there was one interesting study that they did where I can't remember if I think it was patients who had a specific part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, that was involved in the emotional side of things for decision making, and it got obliterated. Those individuals, as much logic as they had, they could not make a decision because the feeling component was gone. So decisions in life, they're always emotionally based every single time, because we are emotional beings. And that's all that matters to human beings, is how they feel. It doesn't matter about facts. I mean, facts matter, we know that, but feelings and emotions are stronger than facts and logic.
Oh man, this is like a rabbit trail we could just go down. So
Yeah.
we're big proponents of formal logic here on the Working
Yes,
Weights
we are.
LLC
Well,
podcast.
well, good. You should be.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot. All right, we're not going to go down that rabbit trail. All right, so uh, all right, so I have some questions from audience members for you, and
Okay.
then also as a strength coach myself, I program exercises for my clients, and so you've alluded to this as well, but as you go through this process of life and aging, and then particularly when you start exercising, we just start to accumulate and, have to deal with these nagging injuries.
Yep.
So if you could give our audience, and myself, practical advice on a couple of things. So number one being shoulder injuries.
Yep.
And, in that in particular, I think the majority of those that I deal with specifically,
Yep.
and maybe for most of the audience, but you're going to have biceps tendonitis,
Yep.
and we're going to have rotator cuff injuries.
Yep.
So what are some practical things? So from a self-assessment standpoint, and
Yep.
then getting into how can I make this thing feel better so that my quality of life improves?
Yeah. So shoulders are a great example of an accumulation of excessive forces, because the shoulder is the most mobile joint in the body, right? We sacrifice structural integrity for range of motion. That's just how the shoulder is. But because we do that, the shoulder is so dependent on the structures around it that they're moving optimally, so the shoulder can stay in the socket and rotate in the socket effectively. And when the parts around it, say the neck, the T-spine doesn't extend, the T-spine doesn't rotate, the shoulder blade, the scapula doesn't set or move like it's supposed to, that poor shoulder joint gets the crap kicked out of it. If we can't extend the shoulders, at least to a minimum 50 degrees, we shouldn't be doing dips. Because, when we look at that shoulder position, if it's pitching and rolling forward because of a lack of mobility, well, that bicep tendon is now getting shredded and tensed, pushed on, even with a push-up. You need at least 45 degrees to get to a full push-up. So you can do something as simple as, if you stand up against the wall with your spine flat, can you at least touch your hands to the wall? Yes or no, right? Like, that's a simple shoulder screen. If you can't get the shoulders to the wall without arching your back, you probably shouldn't press overhead. Because if I try and press overhead, I'm either going to go into my lower back, or if I keep my core locked on and my pelvis in position, now the shoulder's in front of my ear, and now there's excessive shear coming through that shoulder, right? Do I have at least that 90 degrees, 180 degrees rotation? If I'm missing internal rotation in the shoulder, is it nerve? Is it a scap issue? Is it the rib cage? Is it a spinal issue? So we can kind of pick apart the pieces around the shoulder of, if they're not moving, well, forces are going to move into that shoulder, and the poor rotator cuff gets punished. The rotator cuff are these four little muscles that keep the shoulder in the socket. Yes, they do some of this, but if the parts around it, say the pec or the lat or the tricep, are not working like they're supposed to because of a nerve impingement, well, guess what? C5, C6, they supply the rotator cuff. They're working just fine. So now the nervous system's like, well, we got to use the rotator cuff more to pick up for the pec and the lat. So to make a long story short, again, we want to have some form of self-assessment. Can we sit and rotate a minimum 45 degrees? Yes or no? Can we get our arms up overhead? Yes or no? Can we reach behind our back and touch the opposite shoulder blade? Yes or no? And if we can't do those, then we have to start to sort out some of those pieces around the shoulder so that the shoulder doesn't get beat up on, because physics tells us energy moves to the area of least resistance. And if we move well in one part, we're just going to move more into it. And that's typically the shoulder. So when I'm rehabbing shoulders, I look at the neck, I look at nerve tension, I look at the thoracic spine, I look at breathing, I look at shoulder blade, scapula, I look at pelvic control, and I look at single leg balance. And then I'll look down chain. What's the elbow doing? If the elbow can't rotate, right, and I'm doing a push-up or a pull-up, guess what I have to rotate more into? I have to give up that shoulder. If I have a wrist that doesn't meet that 80 degrees extension when I'm doing push-ups, guess what I have to give up? I got to give up that shoulder to make up for the wrist mobility issues. So I wish I could give a simpler answer to what can we do for the shoulder. And they're having some form of assessment, again, picking off the piece, especially if there's painful shoulders. But think about also, how did we develop our shoulders in the beginning as babies? Did we give them rotator cuff exercises? Because babies have super hypermobile, unstable shoulders. No, they climb, they crawl, they carry. They have the 3 C's. And when I mean climb, they hang. Kids intuitively want to hang off stuff, and they want you to swing them. And when my kids were little, they want me to swing them. I always made sure they had a firm grip on my thumb, and I would watch their shoulders pack into place. Well, that was the rotator cuff working at a reflex level with the grip. Cool. Now their shoulders are safe. I can swing them around. But as soon as their nervous system got tired, they would let go. When they crawl, they compress the shoulders, right? They have to kind of move the shoulders through the full range of motion through compression with a straight arm. So now we've got some different proprioception going on, and they crawl in different ways. They bear crawl, they crab crawl, they push up from the side. So there's all kinds of different pressing positions, but now they've gone back down to the floor to orient themselves, and they're also stabilizing their spine and their neck with the shoulder. And then the last one is carry. Biologically, when we developed or through evolution, we don't deadlift things repeatedly. We pick them up once and we walk them someplace, right? Because we need to move things around. So when we do deadlifts, again, we're getting that nice grip reflex going. We're getting the traction going into the shoulder that we have to kind of hold and stabilize. And then we have to walk. Now we have to dissociate the hips, but we have to stabilize the spine and improve our posture. So now we've kind of going after the posture component with shoulders. And if you do those 3 things as a warm-up for your shoulders, watch how much things change for your clients, because it just might be those simple inputs that they're lacking.
Okay. Are you familiar with starting strength?
No.
Okay, so the guy's name is Mark Ripito, starting strength.
Mark Ripito. Okay,
and then as you're talking about pressing overhead and the shoulder problems, so I have my own issues with some of the things with starting strength. However, one of the fantastic things that I like about their program and the way that they teach lifts is particularly the overhead press. The way that they teach it is done in a manner where people who otherwise, so Stan Efferding, the Rhino, so he had given up overhead pressing for a while, and then he went to a few starting strength seminars, and I think he actually went through their whole course, but he started overhead pressing again because of the way it's taught through them. So just as I think it's something to look into, for your side of it, physiotherapy. The way they teach it is fantastic, and I've had 85-year-old ladies who have 85 degrees of range of motion here, and we get them overhead pressing within a couple months.
Perfect.
So cool stuff there. All right, man. Working our way down to the hips.
Yes.
So a lot of my audience is over 40, and being able to hinge over or get up and down from the floor. I guess we can get into knees with this as well. What are things that we need to start looking at? People who are having a hard time, like it's stiff, it's high, I have a hard time bending over.
Yep.
What do you
arthritis.
got for them? Yeah.
So again, for them, I would start at the floor, like get them laying on their back, do an active straight leg raise. What does the right and left look like? Okay. If they have a lot of tension in their posterior chain, maybe we just need to do a little bit of core work. Maybe we need to do some sling work. Maybe we need to go after their center first. Maybe we need to stabilize this to allow the hips to start to let go. Because oftentimes what you'll see when the center, when our center of mass, when our spine starts to become weak or dissociated or just deconditioned, the nervous system will often draw tension from the hamstrings, the glutes, the hip flexors, the quads to try and stabilize the back and the pelvis. Because from a development perspective, the spine takes priority for survival over the hips. So the body will sacrifice the hips for the spine, and all of a sudden they become tight. If you get them on the floor and just build a little bit better awareness, a little bit better connection on a spine supported position, and then you flip them over into a quadruped, say some kind of crawl position, or you're doing some dead bugs, bird dogs, whatever, watch how when you stand them back up, their hip hinge might get better, simply because we stabilize that central axis, simply because they feel a little bit more safe and secure around that. So the nervous system lets those hamstrings go, or lets that hip bend, because they don't need the tension from the hips to stabilize their back and pelvis at that point, because something feels different. So knowing also, are we dealing with a structural problem, or is this a motor control problem? If someone's passive range of motion, you take their leg and it's like greater than 90 degrees, you already know there's no structural problem there. But if they can't do it, they have a strength control issue, and oftentimes it's actually the spine and the pelvis. So if you go after that, again, top down, center out, how we developed, if you just stabilize and do some things for the center core in a very simple ground-based position or ground-based approach, the hips will often let go if it's not a structural problem. Now, if we do have some capsular restriction, or we do have some arthritic changes, that might need a little bit more specificity to the joint. This is where you can put a band on their hip, or you do some manual therapy with a band to try and get those hips to rotate. Or even more simple, have them sit cross-legged if they can, shin boxed, and do some breathing. Whatever seated position you can get them in, have them just be there, pain-free, and breathe. Because if they're holding a position that's kind of uncomfortable, but they can breathe through it, and all of a sudden the nervous system starts to calm down and say, oh, this isn't that bad. Now all of a sudden it will let go, and those hips start to move a little bit better. But if there is structural issues, and the hips are very limited with rotation or hip extension because of capsular restrictions or degenerative changes, those individuals will need a little bit of that outside forces or outside involvement using bands or some manual therapy work, just to kind of get them to feel where the joint's kind of going in space, or where it needs to be positioned to be a little bit more effective. So if you've ever seen, again, like Kelly Starrett's book, The Supple Leopard, he's got all the hip mobility stuff. Some of that, most of it's great. Depending on age population, can you get them into those positions? It might be a little bit difficult, but just getting them back on the floor and sitting in certain positions and work on breathing and posture can be very helpful for the older population to at least start to feel differently in their body, to allow their nervous system to let go, to allow them to move into those positions.
Yeah. So we mentioned the bands on the joints a couple of times.
Yep.
I've never understood exactly what is the
Yep.
band doing.
So it's creating space. So there's a Kiwi New Zealand physio, Brian Mulligan. He came up with this way to bypass so joint manipulation was a very popular thing. And he's like, well, how do we integrate movement with mobilizations? And his idea of like using kind of this seatbelt strap around a hip or a shoulder joint, and have the patient actively move while you're creating distraction, or while you're creating this glide on a joint, and it started to restore movement faster, simply because it was improving the proprioception of their joint mechanics. Their nervous system was like, oh, the joint's supposed to go back this way when I lift, not this way. And all of a sudden, movement would start to free up. So the point of the bands is to create space. And then as you move around it, kind of like, let's say the shoulder or the hip joint, as you move the body around that distraction, it creates a little bit of a stretch and different feeling or awareness or proprioception in the joint itself. Now, all of a sudden, the muscles can relax a little bit better and they're not compressing the joint so much. That's the idea behind it, right?
Hmm.
You can get
Has
into,
it,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry, yeah. Has that ever like has everybody ever done an X-ray or something while having the band on there? Does it actually create a physical space, or because it makes sense to me from like as you're saying proprioception,
Yep.
a lot of this stuff makes sense to me
Sure.
where a lot of these things are inputs and outputs from the brain, and I like the way Mike Israel puts it is like,
Yep.
you know, jump on the concrete and, you know, you're going to go straight up, and then you get on some slick ice and try and
Yep.
jump, you go nowhere.
Yeah.
And so, you know, as you're saying, like a lot of these problems with ranges of motion or tight joints or whatever, is a problem of uh, your brain, you know, senses a weakness at that range of motion or in that position, and so it stops you from going any farther.
Yeah. Or it's a
So,
lack
but
of
yeah,
it's a lack of safety, right? It's just,
yeah.
it's unfamiliar.
Hmm.
Anything that's unfamiliar, if we don't, that's where the whole, you don't use it, you lose it. If you're not using a range of motion, the body will just be like, well, I don't feel safe there anymore. I don't feel strong. I'm just not going to let you go there. So all of a sudden, that's the problem. So it might not be, oftentimes it's not a tight tissue. It's not a joint issue. It's just, it's a lack of, you know, movement into that space with load, and body's just like, I don't feel safe, so I'm not going to let you go there. And now something's tight, right? And that's what the bands are essentially doing. We can come up with a lot of arthrokinematics and, well, it's a ball and hip socket joint, and when to get better hip extension, we create an anterior glide. We can get a little specific. We're coming up with theories and ideas of what we think is going on. But at the end of the day, if we got change, right, and it's lasting, who gives a shit? Like,
You're right. Yep. I say that
Yeah.
all the time. I get people like, well, I don't know if this placebo, whatever, and it's like, who cares, man? Like,
Right.
I don't care, like, if whether or not this band is actually opening up a hip joint. I know, you know, I'm just curious to see if anybody's actually done the study to see if it's actually quote unquote doing something.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if it improves someone's quality of life and it allows them to do that thing that they couldn't do before, like, it just, you're right. You're like, who cares? Just do it. Right?
Yeah. It's like
evidence.
Yeah.
It's like evidence-based medicine. You know?
Yeah. It's
What's
like,
your evidence? Oh,
it's
well,
like,
it works.
everyone, you know, and I was on the boat, you know, when all the functional training came out and everyone's shitting on the machines, that's not functional, da, da, da. I'm like, it doesn't matter what it looks like. It's the outcome it provides. If someone needs a little bit of extra quad strength on the knee extensor machine and they squatted better, I'm going to say that was functional. If all of a sudden leg press strengthens up their tendons in their legs and they can jump higher, I'm going to say that's functional. It really depends on the individual. And if there's some weak links, machines are awesome, right? Because you can isolate those weak links and then reintegrate them with the patterns. But at the end of the day, if you're getting the outcomes that you want, it doesn't matter how you got there, what you did to do it, you got it. And we can come up with these ideas and theories of why we think it works. And that's helpful to kind of justify and explain to people when they ask us the question, what is this actually doing? Well, we think it does this. But I think where a lot of people get into trouble is they use deterministic and very confident, language of saying, this is what's happening. I'm like, I don't know if that's happening. I think this is what's happening, but it's working. You know, it's the same thing with manipulation. When we do a spinal manipulation, it's causing a cavitation and there's a gas bubble that releases and it's working on the joint mechanics and this, that, and the other. I'm like, or it's creating a neurophysiological effect that had a positive result. Right? Is your neck moving better? Yep. That's what happens. But you can also, coming back to psychology, people who had a bad experience with a manipulation, guess what manipulation is going to do? It's going to make them worse.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
Make it tense up when you try it.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, this is not the right tool for you because we can needle, we can do joint moves, we can do other stuff. So this is where coming back to, and people who have had great experiences with spinal manipulation, like, yeah, I respond really well. Great. Because your belief system and your nervous system has already ingrained that you're going to get a better outcome from that. So use what works.
And whether or not it's placebo, right? Who cares?
Who cares? And if it doesn't work, don't keep doing it. Do something else. What drives me crazy is people are getting these treatments, these modalities. They're doing the same thing over. And I'm like, well, it's not creating change. Why are you still doing it? I don't know. I'm like, you know what the definition of insanity is, right? Okay, cool. Like doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. we're wasting our time here. So it's part and parcel. The practitioner keeps doing the same thing and not checking their work. And the client keeps going back and giving them money to do the same thing over and over and not creating permanent change. So I'm like, you both are at fault, but I'm still always going to blame the practitioner for not doing something different because they're not measuring their effectiveness in a way that's creating permanent change. And that pisses me off.
Well, and that's a degradation of that relationship too, by the way. The longer they keep going back, and then
but they're so
happening.
nice. They're so nice. You know, they're very nice.
It
I'm
makes
like,
me feel
yes,
I like to talk to them.
Yeah, I know. But do you want to get better, or do you just want to hang out? Like,
Yep, absolutely. So do you think there's a difference between so going through the assessments and then the therapy modalities and maybe the oh, what's the word I'm thinking here? But the stage of progress to get to the end goal. Is there a difference between somebody starting out and somebody who is already 10 years into strongman or something like that?
yep. It's going to be somebody who's just starting out. They're going to see much faster gains, right? They're going to be motivated because they're going to see that quick change. I'm getting stronger. I'm seeing the weight come off, right? And then once the body's got adapted to a certain level, well, it's easy for them to get demotivated because they're putting in the work, but they're not seeing the quick change like they did in the beginning. But that's where we have to educate them as to like, look, we have to stay at this level and plateau for a bit. And then those individuals who've been doing it longer, yeah, you're going to see slower gains, but they also know the process of this is a long game. I mean, there's no end game. It's the game is to keep playing the game. And we'll have clients come in and they're like, oh, I'm in pain. I'm like, yeah, but at least you're not in a state where you couldn't make it to the clinic. At least you're not so degraded that you couldn't get out of bed. So I'm like, we keep doing it. I'm like, you're 72. We've got some old injuries. We just got to keep pushing forward. So I'm not sure if that quite answered your question with regards to, someone who's been doing it for a decade versus a newbie, but I think it's setting the expectations for them to keep them motivated. I'm like, the person who's been doing it for a decade, you're much closer to your end goal, but that road has gotten longer to get to the end goal. That last 10% is a much longer game. But then once you reach the goal, what then? Well, you're going to set the next goal. Like, it's not like I reached it, I'm done, right? Let's go sit on the couch. It's setting the expectations, making sure the psychology component of making those goals, setting that big goal, but hitting those smaller goals along the way to keep them motivated, keep them disciplined so that they don't lose motivation to get to the bigger one. And then once they've gotten there, again, you're going to measure your progress. If we didn't measure where we started, oh, you couldn't touch your toes. Now you're deadlifting 200 pounds. Well, shit, that's good, right? Because people, they'll forget where they were and then they end up where they are. I'm like, look at all the gains you made. Like, and then set the expectations, set the goals, but it's a never ending game. And the game ends when we're in the ground.
Yeah. Well, so you brought up touching your toes several times.
Sorry. Yeah. Just an easy marker to measure.
I gotcha. So how important is that, do you feel? So like I cannot remember a time in my life when I have ever been able to touch my toes. I've never touched my toes, but it has not prevented me from being in, the top 10 of any competitive athletic endeavor that I've done. So like how important is that? I mean, it would be cool if I could touch my toes, but I'm just kind of like giving up on it.
That's fine. So
hey, I'd just like to say, I could never touch my toes until I started deadlifting.
Sure.
And one day, I mean, and as I built gains, I remember one morning I got in the shower and it was in the morning. And I leaned over and I could almost put my palms
on the floor.
Right. I just felt so, I was like, yeah. You know what? Well, it also gave me more confidence when I did my lifts.
Yeah, for sure. Because if we hit tension, now, Dustin, at one point you did touch your toes or else you wouldn't be standing, right?
Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
Right. Because as babies, they can put their palms to the floor and then they hinge and they stand up, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just somewhere got lost along the way.
You
But
little monkey.
but it could have been, there might be structural changes in your hips, in your back that might be preventing you. But if you lift competitively, Dustin,
Mhm.
you have an advantage to use that tension. Maybe for you, because you're more on the competition side of things, being able to touch your toes might give you a disadvantage because you need that connective tissue tension to help lift the weight, right?
Mhm.
When you bend forward and you engage with the bar, your system's already pre-tension. You've got tension on the system through the connective tissue and the muscles are switched on. If you are a yogi and you can fold in half, they're not very good power lifters, right? Because they don't have enough tension. They can't pull the system and compress the system enough. So this is where context matters. For the general population, it is beneficial that they have this free range of motion to get to the floor. Because what if they stumble? What if they trip? What if they have to pick something up from the floor that's not a weight? If they don't have that ability, they are more likely that they might tweak something because they've hit end range of the tissues, they've hit end range of the joints, and all of a sudden things might lock up. For you, being in the competitive space, it's probably a disadvantage that you touch your toes because you need that tension to lift heavy weight repeatedly, correct?
Mhm.
So context matters is where I'm going with this. If, one of my clients, he's the world's strongest man right now. And, he's got mobility issues everywhere, right? Am I going to get him to do a bunch of yoga? No, because he needs that tension in order to carry the things and push the stuff with less work, with less effort, with less muscular tension. If he's got that tightness in his body, it gives him an advantage to lift heavy things. We only go after some of the tension or some of the restrictions if they're causing pain and problems. And then we give him enough mobility so that the pain goes away so that he can keep loading the system. But I'm not going to say you need to do 2 months of yoga. That is not going to keep him the world's strongest man.
Right.
So, but performance and longevity, two different ends of the spectrum. The closer you get to high performance, the less longevity the further away from longevity you are, because you're pushing the body to its maximum to see this potential. Okay. We're not over here to get to 100. I mean, you look at the centenarians, right? They live in these blue zones. They walk all the time, but they're not kicking ass in life, right? Like they're living a long time. They're content. They're eating whole grains. They're not eating much. They're not lifting much. They're moving around a lot, but they're not out crushing their goals. They're just existing, and that's okay. But if your goal is to, be the world's strongest man, lift heavy weight, run fast, just know that there's a cost to it. And if the cost is, well, I might wear my spine down a little bit more than the average over the years, but this goal is way more important to me, then that's for you. So it really depends on the individual and what you need tension for, or what you need mobility for. But for the general population, I'm like, yeah, it's probably a good idea if we kind of reduce the resistance as you bend forward to pick things up so that we might be less likely to injure something.
Yeah.
Right? So the body's not fighting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
that
hope that
makes
clears
sense.
it up. Yeah. So don't worry, Dustin, you're not a bad person for not touching your toes. Okay?
Well, just like all through my
Yeah.
so it's something you hear all the time.
Sure.
It's like touch
I
your
know.
toes, touch your toes. And like I say, I can't ever remember all the way back to my childhood to first memories. I can't remember ever touching my toes.
Sure.
But it's never stopped me from being one of the fastest runners,
No.
from doing, the most I was in the Marines, went through boot camp. I
Yep.
was one of the top, athletic guys there. And it's never prevented me from doing anything. And it's just like, I hear it all the time. And it's like, how important is that really? But as you're saying, this is similar to what I tell my clients when we first come in and we start talking about their goals, and I'll give them a triangle, right?
Yep.
And each point of the triangle says, okay, up here is athletic performance, over here is longevity, and over here is aesthetics.
Yeah.
And you get to put a dot in there, which represents your goal anywhere you want, but understand that the closer we get to one end of that triangle, the farther we are away from the others.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as you made it clear, like this is important in daily for the average person in daily life, where if you can touch your toes, that's less effort, less resistance.
Yep.
To do normal functions every day. So that makes sense. So would you say, like, if I came to you and I was like, hey Tom, I want to touch my toes.
Sure.
You so now that we're getting into this, like I would have to accept some part for probably maybe some period of time
Sure.
where my lifting performance may decrease just a little bit. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say it would decrease. I'd say it would. We'd plateau, right? We wouldn't.
Mm.
You wouldn't be pushing. You wouldn't be pushing the lifts to kind of get greater gains, because, and it depends on what we find. Is it neural tension? Is it tension from the neck? Is it tension from the back? Is it something simple where you just need to kind of change the inputs around a certain structure and all of a sudden the nervous system lets go? It really depends, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you had a disc herniation that was causing nerve impingement, I'm like, well, yeah, we definitely have to, like, that's a structural problem, right? We have to let that heal. So it depends. It's hard to, because I've worked with power lifters, and anytime I gave them mobility, they lifted heavier weight. Anytime I unlocked their ability to move freely through space, their nervous system, they could lift heavier weight, and they would keep doing those things. You know, so it depends on the person. It depends on what's limiting that mobility. It depends on how the nervous system's organized, to really say, well, we might have to, but I'm going to say I don't know.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
I like it. All right, man.
I
Go
have
ahead.
an odd question, real quick, and if it's too long of an answer, or if it's too far off field, then we can move on. But in what you were just talking about like preloaded tension, not being able to maybe touch your toes or whatever.
Sure.
Is there a plus to preload tension, or is there a plus to relaxation? So if Dustin's trying to touch his toes, and he's one of the stronger deadlifters I've ever known, and if he's able to bend over and get relaxation, is that a plus? I'm not saying it's a minus, but because you said the powerlifters that you've worked with, that those guys, if you could get them to, you didn't say the word relaxation,
no,
but
just move a little bit more freely in their
more
body.
motion, then they lifted better.
Yeah, because if they can, and again, we're gonna keep picking on Dustin for not being able to touch his toes,
Worth it,
right?
Yeah.
If we're hinging forward, and the nervous system and the tissues are already taking up tension, it might alter your position. It might alter your posture for your spine, right? In a non-advantageous way. So now the position or the posture is compromised, which will then affect the pattern. And if the pattern is then compromised, it affects power. So it depends on, are you utilizing that tension to set up your posture more effectively? Or is that tension taking you out of posture and not allowing the pattern to fire up and the power to unleash? So again, I'm going to say it depends. And again, some of the ones, you got to remember, the lifters who are coming into me, they're in pain. They're kind of injuring stuff, right? So now I have to change something. If what you're doing is working and you're not in pain, keep doing what you're doing. Don't change anything, right? You're sprinting, you're lifting heavy. Who gives a shit? Like, but when you're in pain, the signal is saying, ooh, something's off. We need to find out what that is so that we don't keep beating this up and it becomes a big problem later, because pain's inhibitory. Pain is a stop signal, not a go signal. And muscles shut off with pain. They get inhibited because it's protective. The body's not going to say, hey, let's jack up the power on this system when there's a pain signal in play, because that's a signal saying something might be wrong. So it depends. Some lifters need to load the spring to move better. Like you'll see, probably Dustin, you put somebody who squats with their body weight, it looks like shit. And also you put a bar on their back and it looks perfect.
That's me.
Right. But you're a very tight spring, and you need to load the spring to make the pattern look good. And as long as it's not causing any problems, that's just who you are, right? But that also gives you a mechanical advantage to lift really heavy weight. Okay. Individuals who have very loose joints, sometimes they start to buckle and collapse underneath the load and their patterns don't look as good. I'm okay, well, those are the individuals who really need to reduce the weight to really work on the posture and the pattern, because they can't even maintain postural integrity to load it. Whereas you can hold that posture, load it, and you actually get better. because it's created some form of stability and control in your system by preloading the system. So long story short, it depends. And it depends on the person, their anatomy, their physiology, their neuromuscular system. It depends. And I'm going to go with, if what you're doing is working, keep doing that. If not, and there's pain, change it. Do something different.
I like those answers. All right, man.
Very good.
This has been a good conversation. So Tom, the last question that we have, well, this isn't the last question, but the next to last question that we have for all the guests. If you could give everybody one piece of advice that doesn't have anything to do with exercise or nutrition, but it's going to improve their life, what would that one piece of advice be?
The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So
Wow.
people look at, I should have started 20 years ago. I'm like, yeah, it would have been good, but today's that next best day to start.
That's good stuff.
So, and then staying consistent. When you don't feel like doing it, do something. Like, we can train every day. It just depends on, well, how do we feel? Like, if we feel like we're kind of kick ass today, go lift heavy weights, go jump, go sprint. If we're kind of gassed and the body's saying, you know what, maybe today's not a high intensity day, get on the ground, do some mobility work, do some balance work, do some accessory work. We can always put in some form of work. But if we move every day and stay consistent, those gains continue to go through our entire life.
Very cool. All right, Tom, where can people find you?
So website is amtcertified.ca for your clinicians, for your coaches who want to kind of level up their practices. My YouTube is Tommy Swales, so lots of free stuff, longer format videos on there. Instagram is swales.tom, LinkedIn's Tom Swales, and Facebook's the same. So lots of free content up there, courses, webinars, what have you.
Yeah, and Tom's Instagram page has plenty of self-assessment tools that you can use, and also I did see some practical exercises and drills in there that people can do. So if you're having problems with those areas that we saw, check out Tom's Instagram page. All right, man, this was a great time. Lots of info. Thanks for coming on.
No, thanks for having me, fellas.
Good stuff. Thanks, Tom.
All right, everybody. Coach Lambie, Dwayne, and Tom out.